Questions without notice. The Prime Minister.
Thank you. I inform the House that the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment will be absent from question time today and the remainder of the week. The Treasurer will answer questions on his behalf in the Trade, Tourism and Investment portfolio, and I'll answer questions in the Foreign Affairs and International Development and the Pacific portfolio. The Minister for Veteran Affairs will also be absent from question time today, and the Minister for Defence will answer questions on his behalf. And to add to the ministerial representations arrangements I referred to yesterday for the Minister for Defence Industry, but also Minister for Science and Technology, questions relating to the Minister for Science and Technology will be handled by the Minister for Energy.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Just now at the National Press Club, we've heard Ms Grace Tame and Ms Brittany Higgins deliver powerful calls for change. Will the Prime Minister act on their call by taking re-election, including by adopting firm targets in the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I welcome the question from the Leader of the Opposition and commend all of those who have worked so hard to ensure that issues, particularly regarding ending domestic violence and violence against women and children, for that matter, Mr Speaker, across this country, receives such national prominence. And that's what the National Plan is all about. The National Plan to End Violence Against Women is a bipartisan, multi-jurisdiction commitment that began by Prime Minister Gillard. And at that time, Mr Speaker, it was supported by the coalition in opposition, and it has been most heavily supported by the coalition in government, some $2 billion invested. When the plan was first announced, it wasn't combined with the funding of that order, Mr Speaker. Indeed, there weren't initially federal commitments to the funding of the National Plan, because the National Plan was principally about dealing with issues that were being addressed by the states and the territories. Now that continues, but in the most recent budget, some $1.2 billion was invested as a down payment, and with further resources to be committed to that plan to ensure that we do everything we possibly can to support the very important cause of ending violence against women. So we will be working continually through that cooperative, bipartisan, multi-partisan, I should say, process, and supporting that national plan in a way that no previous government has, Mr Speaker. And we will continue those investments because they are getting those results. $2 billion on women's safety has been already committed and spent by this government since 2013. And to correct my understatement, $1.1 billion on women's safety in the package that was handed down by the Treasurer in the budget for 21-22. Now, there's $165 million also, most recently, in escaping violence payments to support those programs. There was $73 million for the Safe Places Emergency Accommodation Program, and that's assisting some 6,340 people escaping family and domestic violence each year. There's $22 million to establish a Domestic Violence and Sexual Violence Commission to oversee the implementation of the next national plan to end violence against women and children. There's $26.2 million to create a safe space online for women and children, including funding for the E-Safety Commission to bolster its investigations team into cyberbullying and harmful online content. And there was $73 million since 2016 on multiple prevention campaigns, including the Stop It at the Start and Help Us Here. So yes, we will join with all others in this place in ensuring that we have targets as are set out collectively and agreed together, and more importantly than that, putting in place the funding as we have demonstrated as a government since first elected and even our most recent budget to ensure the federal government is doing its part to end violence against women and children in this country.
The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on actions the Morrison government is taking to improve the safety and economic security of women and girls?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question. And I thank the member for Lindsay and the many members of my team for the incredible job they have done in supporting the government in framing the policies that go to the very question that the member has asked in preventing violence against women in this country, to improve their safety and the economic security, indeed, of women and girls. Yesterday, was an important occasion in this place where we acknowledged and apologised for the unacceptable history of workplace bullying, sexual harassment and sexual assault here in Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. But as we all know, these issues are not isolated to this workplace or this place more broadly, not even as a workplace. These issues affect Australians all over the country. And so, Mr Speaker, in answer to the Leader of the Opposition's question, I have set out the very significant investments that we've been making as a government, but not on our own, in partnership and as part of a national plan that is pulled together by those who are working at the coalface in this issue, all the way through to those designing policy at state and territory and not-for-profit organisations, Commonwealth Government. I thank all of them for their tremendous work, and it's very important work. As I said, work that began under Prime Minister Gillard and continues under my Prime Ministership, Mr Speaker, and all of those in between. And I think with an equally shared passion and commitment, and our government will continue to do that. But, Mr Speaker, another very important area where the government has acted on the safety of women is in the area of women's health. And, Mr Speaker, this morning I heard a very brave story from Amy Phillips, who lives here in Canberra. She has 3 boys, 9, 16 and 17, and she is suffering from ovarian cancer. And today was the Ovarian Cancer Australia breakfast today. And the Teal support program that has been so important in her experience, something began some years ago, under this government, Mr Speaker, supported, I should say, Ovarian Cancer Australia. We committed on a bipartisan basis, Mr Speaker, this morning, the Leader of the Opposition made a similar commitment to see that program continue into the future. But that backs in some $21 million, particularly in ovarian cancer research, that has been so important to support women in that position. There's also the Lynparza and the many other drugs that have been approved under the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. Now, I think it's 285. I think, Mr Speaker, sorry, I correct myself, 857 new medicines have been listed on the PBS just since the last election. And for women in particular, where it's the listing of Kisqali or the listing of Aripro, which is to prevent women from going into premature labour. Mr Speaker, 2 days paid miscarriage leave for miscarriages, the National Stillbirth Action Plan, improvements to the cervical and breast cancer screening programs, the endometriosis action plan.
Expired. And I give the call to the member for Lilly.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why didn't the Prime Minister agree to the recommendation of the Respect at Work report that employers have a positive duty to protect workers from sexual harassment in the workplace?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, 42 of the 55 recommendations of the Respect at Work report are fully implemented and are fully funded with over $60 million in commitment, and work is underway on all of the recommendations.
The order. The member for Wentworth has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Australia is facing one of the most significant shifts in our global and regional security environment since before the Second World War. Will the Prime Minister please inform the House how strong and principled beliefs and actions are necessary to keep Australians safe during these uncertain times?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question, and he brings much experience to the management of these international issues, certainly to the coalition ranks, Mr Speaker, and I thank him for his service in the diplomatic corps. Mr Speaker, Australia is facing one of the most challenging international environments and regional environments we've seen since the Second World War. And, Mr Speaker, the response of our government has been very clear as to how we're going to address those challenges. The first of those responses, Mr Speaker, is this government will always stand up for the values of Australia. We will always stand up to coercion. We will always call it out, Mr Speaker. We will always put our national interests first, and we would never, ever, ever trade away our values, Mr Speaker, and those of the Australian people. And we have been commended for that approach, Mr Speaker. Earlier today, I was able, as was the Minister for Foreign Affairs, to meet with the Lithuanian Foreign Minister, another country in Europe, Mr Speaker, who understands what it's like to be coerced by those in our region, Mr Speaker, one in particular, and we will continue to stand up for Australia's values in the face of threats and coercion. Secondly, Mr Speaker, the way you keep Australia's resilience strong is you keep your economy strong. Because if you don't have a strong economy, Mr Speaker, then you cannot invest in the defence capabilities, intelligence capabilities, law enforcement capabilities that are necessary to keep Australians safe. Whether that's protecting our borders, Mr Speaker, or whether it's ensuring we're investing in the defence capabilities that are necessary. And, Mr Speaker, you've got to defend Australia, and you've got to be prepared to defend Australia and commit to those assets, Mr Speaker, whether it is the once-in-a-generation opportunity we now have to build a nuclear submarine capability in this country, Mr Speaker, brought about by this government through the AUKUS arrangement, which, Mr Speaker, we were able to put in place, or it is the many other defence acquisitions and developments we are engaged in at this very time. But it's also about defending Australia here within the country, ensuring that we're standing up, Mr Speaker, when it comes to organised crime or counter-terrorism threats or things of that nature. Mr Speaker, it's about building our alliances and partnerships. And whether it's the first country to ever have a comprehensive strategic partnership with the ASEAN nations, which is the reboot and revamp, Mr Speaker, of the Quad, which is so important for regional security, the securing of the AUKUS arrangement, Mr Speaker, the most significant development in our relations with the United States and the United Kingdom, particularly the United States, since ANZUS, Mr Speaker, which is enabling us to keep Australians safe. And it's about always standing up and championing a world order that favours freedom, Mr Speaker. And that's what this government will always do. That's why Australians have always trusted the coalition parties when it comes to national security, where we'll never have an each-way bet.
Order. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the government vote against implementing the Respect at Work recommendation to establish a positive duty on employers to protect workers from sexual harassment in the workplace?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Minister and the Prime Minister for the opportunity to respond to the question about the Respect at Work report. The question goes particularly to a positive duty. Recommendation 17, positive duty of the Respect at Work report, will require further consideration and consultation to examine the merits and ensure that such a duty would operate effectively alongside existing duties that already exist under work health and safety laws and the Sex Discrimination Act, including to ensure that additional complexity is not created for those seeking to use the protections. Significant thought also needs to be given before providing the Australian Human Rights Commission with inquiry and regulatory powers for discrimination and harassment, in addition to its existing dispute resolution function. I make the point, Mr Speaker, that work is underway on all remaining recommendations. As the Prime Minister rightly said, 42 of the 55 recommendations have been either fully implemented or funded. The Morrison government has made significant progress on implementing the Respect at Work recommendations and will continue to do so. Work is underway on all remaining recommendations, noting that 4 recommendations, of course, were directed at the private sector, not at government. And I want to assure the House, Mr Speaker, and to clear up the unfortunate confusion that may have been generated by the Shadow Minister's question, no recommendations have been rejected. I make that very clear. No recommendations have been rejected.
The member for Clark has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Health Minister. Minister, the latest report on government services highlights again that Tasmania's health system is one of the worst in the country. Indeed, 42% of patients presenting to Tasmanian emergency departments wait longer than recommended times, and the median wait for elective surgery is 65 days and up to 588 days for some patients. Minister, the impact of all this is obviously devastating, and just hoping the situation will improve is madness. Clearly a solution is needed that includes more funding and expert advice. So, Minister, as it's clear that the Tasmanian government is incapable of fixing the mess, will you intervene and help sort it out?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Clark for his question. The Australian government has contributed to significant increase in expansion in Tasmanian hospital capacity and funding. We've gone from approximately $291 million of funding in the year prior to coming to government to $511 million, or a 75% increase in the previous full year. That will increase, however, significantly over the course of the current 5-year hospitals agreement, which will see an approximately $615 million increase against the last agreement over this 5-year period. So what we see is we will have gone from $291 million of Commonwealth funding to $511 million of Commonwealth funding, and that will continue to increase to what is likely to be almost $600 million of funding. So a doubling of funding and beyond in our time, on our watch. So that's adding significant capacity and capability to the Tasmanian hospital system. In addition to that, though, during the course of COVID, because the member is correct, right around the country where there have had to have been pauses in elective surgery, that has had an impact on people. We have specifically supported the Tasmanian hospital system with $145 million of COVID funding, in addition to that which has been in place through the National Hospital Reform Agreement, through the National Partnership for COVID with the states and territories. So that $145 million is specifically designed to address precisely the issue which the member has raised. In addition to that, under this Prime Minister, we also allocated $20 million expressly and exclusively focused towards a catch-up in elective surgery in Tasmania. That's in place. That's providing 6,000 surgeries which are being able to help people with all manner of conditions achieve the outcomes which they so significantly need to assist themselves. Tasmania itself has also been contributing. I would note that the vaccination rate in Tasmania is above 99% for first doses and 96.8% for second doses. Each is about 3% ahead of the already high national average, which is world-leading. Tasmania has added 870 staff to their health system since July of 2020, 152 new beds, and they have 367 ventilators. I did hear recently that, and I quote, "We haven't had enough ventilators in Australia." That statement was false. That statement was in relation to a country which at peak ventilation capacity for COVID required 206. We have 7,500 ventilators in Australia. The Leader of the Opposition made that statement and it was plain false.
The Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government responded to supply chain challenges in the Northern Territory and South Australia as a result of recent floods? And specifically, how has this supported my home state of Western Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and note also his very strong support and continually fighting for the maintenance of the live sheep and live cattle industry, incredibly important to the people of Western Australia. Mr Speaker, on the 21st of January, a once-in-a-lifetime or once-in-a-200-year flooding event occurred in the deserts between Western Australia, South Australia and the Northern Territory, 200 millimetres of rain. This brought about the loss of about 300 kilometres or damage of 300 kilometres of rail track near Tarcoola and also north into Darwin and the Northern Territory. Mr Speaker, I think it is a great testament to our nation on all levels of government how we work together to make sure that the food continued to go into the shelves of Perth and into the shelves of Darwin. The government immediately engaged with industry and jurisdictions to keep freight moving and maintain food supplies and essential items to Western Australia and the Northern Territory. The National Coordination Mechanism was established to coordinate arrangements. The National Heavy Vehicle Regulator secured approval from South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland for triple road trains to operate via defined routes to carry essential food and grocery items to the Northern Territory, with trucks operating from the 29th of January. I also had I had a lot of work to do with the West Australian Transport Minister, Minister Rita Saffioti, and I'd like to commend her for the way that we work together in such a form as to keep food on the shelves in Western Australia. On the 31st of January, I issued a coastal shipping exemption to allow commercial vessels to carry goods to Western Australia without requiring a temporary permit until the March 22nd. Shipping companies have responded strongly and are already contracted 60,000 tonnes to move via sea. The government also arranged for the ADF to airlift essential supplies into Coober Pedy, with 13 flights from the 31st of January to the 4th of February. On the 2nd of February, the government established a hybrid road and rail bridge, providing connectivity between Whyalla and Kalgoorlie via road trains, moving 5,000 pallets per week. Mr Speaker, this shows the capacity for both our side and working with the West Australian government for the management of our nation, to keep food on the table, to follow a process where we manage to make sure that the shelves of the supermarkets of Perth had food on their shelves, and we managed to avert what could have been a major crisis. Because, Mr Speaker, it wasn't just the food, it was also the essential elements so that their drinking water could be maintained in a potable form. Mr Speaker, this is a clear example of how, when the management of this side of the chamber is in such a form so exemplary that it's such a major crisis was averted, didn't make the news.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. A year ago, the Prime Minister told the House he'd asked his former Chief of Staff to investigate what his office knew and when about the reported assault of Ms Higgins just metres from his office. How is it possible that he still doesn't know who in his office knew what and when?
Just before I call the Prime Minister, I do want to make a statement about this, and I'd ask all members for their very careful attention. Members know that sometimes during proceedings they might refer to specific or more general legal matters. From time to time, speakers find it necessary to remind members about the powerful privilege of freedom of speech which attaches to those contributions. With this privilege comes the responsibility for us all to choose our words very carefully, with due regard to potential consequences. This is especially so in relation to remarks about a specific criminal matter where charges have been laid. The Sub Judice Convention of the House is one guide to us in exercising the free speech privilege responsibly. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind members that while the House has an inherent right to inquire into and debate matters of public importance, at the same time, the Speaker has discretion to ensure that the House does not set itself up as an alternative forum to the courts or that proceedings of the House might interfere with the course of justice. It's natural that members might take a special interest in a criminal matter which relates to the Parliament or the parliamentary precincts. Nevertheless, such an aspect does not relieve us of our responsibilities. I would therefore remind all members to exercise the rights they have as members responsibly in order not to risk prejudicing any court proceedings. And the Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, Secretary Gaetjens advised in August of 2021 that he had suspended his inquiry until the criminal proceedings had been finalised, and this was based, Mr Speaker.
The member for Isaacs is warned.
Mr Speaker, this was based on legal advice following the ACT's DPP's position that any further action on the Gaetjens inquiry could be highly prejudicial to those proceedings. Mr Speaker, I take the interjection from the member for Isaacs. If he believes that we should act contrary to the advice we have received on that matter, as the alternative he's seeing
the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And because of previous questions, I can understand the Prime Minister might have thought this was something different, but in terms of direct relevance, this is not a question. It's direct relevance. This is not a question about the Gaetjens report. This is a question about whether or not it's possible that the Prime Minister still does not himself know the answer to this.
The question does go to the investigation that was engaged by the Prime Minister with his Chief of Staff, and in relation to the delay that's been spoken of in the question. So I'll ask the Prime Minister to return to the question. I don't think you're far off it, Prime Minister, as far as relevance is concerned, but I would ask you to deal with the delay issue, please.
Well, Mr Speaker, thank you. Both the point of order and the question asserts conclusions, Mr Speaker, that have not been found, one. And secondly, Mr Speaker, the DPP's position that any further action on the Gaetjens inquiry could be highly prejudicial to those proceedings. The member for Isaacs is the alternative senior law officer of this country who would so willingly ask the government to disregard such advice, Mr Speaker, reflects appallingly on his own legal judgment, Mr Speaker, and why he'd be ever unfit to hold that office.
Members on my left, the interjections are far too high. The interjections are far too high. If I can't hear the Prime Minister when points of order are taken, then it makes my life very difficult as the Speaker. The member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House of the Morrison government's strong record of helping families and small businesses keep more of the money they earn through tax cuts? How is the Morrison government's tax reforms securing Australia's economic recovery, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Longman for his question. I had the opportunity to visit his electorate in recent weeks and, Mr Speaker, do a small business forum with him and recognise his experience and background in small business. Now, Mr Speaker, the next election is only months away, and a key battle line will be tax. And the Coalition's values, its record and its policy speak to one thing: lower taxes, Mr Speaker, and the same cannot be said about the Labor Party. We have, since coming to government, cut taxes for families. So somebody on $60,000 a year is paying $2,160 less tax today than they did when Labor was in office. We've cut taxes for small business down to their lowest level in 50 years, and we've put the biggest investment incentives through the tax system in Australia's history.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. Treasurer will resume his seat. I'm going to issue a general warning. The interjections are too high. I don't need to issue a warning. I can act under 94A without issuing a warning. I've tried to be as lenient as I possibly can. All members have now been warned. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Our tax cuts have helped the Australian economy have a strong recovery from the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. The fact that unemployment today is at a 13-year low of 4.2% compared to when Labor was last in office of 5.7%. And our tax cuts have been opposed every step of the way by this leader of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, a leader of the Labor Party who's never held a Treasury portfolio, a leader of the Labor Party who attacked our tax cuts for families and called them the top end of town, and a leader of the Labor Party who's too weak to stand up to the Greens and the unions, and a leader of the Labor Party who every day of his political career has been standing for higher taxes. The Leader of the Labor Party has stood for carbon tax, Mr Speaker, has stood for a mining tax, has advocated a congestion tax, Mr Speaker, who advocated for higher superannuation taxes, higher income taxes, a housing tax, a retirees tax and a tax on family businesses. But most damning of all is the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the Labor Party, standing and advocating for death duties, Mr Speaker, death duties. Now, yesterday in this House he called that a lie, but this is what he said in his own words to Labor Centenary Conference. Comrade Chair, I am pleased to move this resolution, which is calling on the government to consider the imposition of an inheritance tax, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Labor Party might want a fact-free election, but the fact is this Leader of the Labor Party stands...
Did you have a point of order? The Treasurer has resumed his. I think he's completed his answer. But just before I call a member for Rankin, I just want to reiterate: it is very difficult to hear anyone at the dispatch box when there is a wall of noise. And I will act under 94A. The difficulty I have is everyone's wearing masks and it's often hard to see whose mouths are moving. That shouldn't be a licence to carry on. The member for Rankin has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question to the Treasurer and it refers to his answer just now. Has the current coalition government taxed Australians more or less than the last Labor government?
The Treasurer has the call.
The hapless member for Rankin, Mr Speaker, the hapless member for Rankin, a shadow of a shadow Treasurer, forgets one basic economic fact.
The Treasurer will resume his seat for one moment. The Treasurer was asked about the differences between the government's taxes and the opposition's taxes. The Treasurer will remain relevant to the question. And that doesn't give the Treasurer a licence to immediately launch into an attack on the member for Rankin.
Mr Speaker, today, if you're a part-time teacher, Mr Speaker, or a part-time nurse, or if you're working in a trade and you earn $60,000 a year, you pay $2,160 less tax under this coalition than when Labor was last in office. $2,160 less tax today than when Labor was last in office. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin should know this, because it's in the budget papers. When it comes to a tax to GDP ratio, we are expecting in 21-22 22.3. We're expecting 22-23 of 21.4 because we've legislated significant tax cuts. Now, at the last election, the shadow Treasurer stood there with the member for McMahon and advocated for a housing tax, a retirees tax, a superannuation tax, a family business tax. You know what the tax to GDP ratio would have been under the Labor Party today? It's 22.3, 25.9%, Mr Speaker. Now, the reality is, every day that we have been in government, we have been looking for opportunities to cut taxes. Every day Labor was in government,
the member for Dunkley will leave under 94A. The Leader of the Opposition on point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. On relevance, it was a very short question. It went to the Treasurer has given some of the answers, which are both higher than the 21.7%, which was the maximum under Labor, which was the figure in 2008.
The Leader of the Opposition, the point of order is not an opportunity to state your policies or past policies. The Treasurer
I'd like to help the Leader of the
Treasurer
Opposition.
has the call.
Yeah, I'd like to help the Leader of the Opposition, but he's never held a Treasury portfolio. But the economy is some $500 billion bigger today than when Labor left office, Mr Speaker. There's some 1.7 million more Australians in work today than when Labor left office. There are some 1 million more women in work today than when Labor left office. So I've got a news flash for the Leader of the Opposition. When more people are in work, more people are paying tax and less people are on welfare, Mr Speaker. And I can tell you right now that the company tax rate for small businesses, which motivates those on this side of the House, is 25 cents in the dollar, Mr Speaker, the lowest level in 50 years, Mr Speaker. And we have legislated through the Parliament tax cuts that reform the tax system so that 95% of income earners pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. So if you're earning between $45,000 and $200,000, you'll pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. So, Mr Speaker, we can't match the Labor Party for a carbon tax. We can't match the Labor Party for a mining tax. We can't match the Leader of the Opposition on a congestion tax. We can't match the Leader of the Opposition on debt duties. But what we can do is cut taxes for Australian families and small businesses, and that's what we do every single day.
Order. The Treasurer's time has expired. Member for Rankin and the member for Chifley. Member for Chifley will leave under 94A. Member for Chifley will leave under 94A. The member for Rankin, I am mindful of precedents that some degree of greater lenience is provided to the front bench, and that is the only reason why you're still sitting there. Member for Higgins has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government's strong economic management is driving thousands of new jobs every week around the country, which has the unemployment rate on a path to its lowest level in 50 years? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Higgins for a question, acknowledge her deep experience in the medical field before coming to this place, and I had the opportunity to visit a local cafe in her electorate, eat an espresso, and to meet Jed, the owner, employs 20 staff, and he told us how JobKeeper had been critical to that business's survival, and now the customers were coming back through the doors, and he's looking with confidence to the year ahead. And so too are many other Australian businesses, despite the challenges we face. Yesterday there was a NAB business survey, and the NAB business survey saw a 15-point increase, Mr Speaker, in business confidence, a 15-point increase into positive territory, with the chief economist pointing to an expectation of a strong economic recovery. Now, Mr Speaker, our focus since coming to government has been on jobs. And despite the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression, we have an unemployment rate today at 4.2%, a 13-year low, on track to a 50-year low, Mr Speaker. We have 1.7 million more Australians in work today than when we came to government, 1 million more women in work today than when we came to government, and, of course, a record number of Australians in a trade apprenticeship. That's a clear contrast from those opposite. That's a clear contrast from those opposite when 1 in 8 manufacturing jobs were lost under the Labor Party and 1 million fewer women were in work. So we'll continue to invest in skills, we'll continue to invest in infrastructure, we'll continue to invest in tax cuts, we'll continue to invest in the digital economy and in our sovereign manufacturing capability to create more jobs. But, Mr Speaker, we can't take this economic recovery for granted. And the biggest risk to the economic recovery is the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the Labor Party, somebody who has never held a Treasury portfolio, Mr Speaker, somebody who attacked tax cuts for families has been for the top end of town, Mr Speaker, and a Leader of the Labor Party too weak to stand up to the unions and the Greens.
Treasurer will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on direct relevance, Mr Speaker. I refer to I've got a series of precedents here of rulings with respect to when alternative approaches have been referred to in questions, where it's been made clear that it's not an opportunity to give a character assessment. That's exactly. Yeah, so I've got them here. 3rd of August 2021, 2nd of June 2021, 1st of June 2021, 26th of May 2021, all the same ruling, ruling out exactly what the Treasurer is now doing, and I ask you to draw him back to the question.
I have actually done some of my own homework on this particular issue, and there has been quite a difference of opinion by speakers throughout recent years on this issue about alternatives. It is a very challenging area that has, I think, a lot of speakers have spoken about in the past about how difficult it is to rule on these things. Some speakers have previously refused or disallowed any part of a question that has those taglines at the end of them. That hasn't been the practice of the immediate speaker before me in relation to alternative approaches or alternative policies. Now, what that doesn't give, it does not then give the member answering the question carte blanche to undertake a gratuitous character assessment. So that has been the approach of Speaker Smith, and I'm happy to take the chamber through the many instances when he has found that, but I don't want to detain the House for an inordinate period. I believe that that is the appropriate course, and I would ask the Treasurer to return to the substance of the question.
About creating jobs. And this is a Leader of the Opposition who doesn't like scrutiny, Mr Speaker, who doesn't like focuses on his record. Now, Mr Speaker, in opposition, well,
the Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr Speaker, it goes to the member completely. Yeah, it's a point of order. You're not in the chair. He is. He is.
The Leader of the Opposition.
He's in charge.
The Leader of the Opposition will come to the point of order.
The point of order is the Treasurer is completely defying your ruling. You just made a clear ruling. He stood up and then just went straight back to where he was.
He's got nothing.
This is where the term character assessment is obviously a very subjective one. I would ask the Treasurer to return to the issue of alternative approaches and not address character assessments, please.
Mr Speaker, the Labor Party talks a big game in opposition, but their record in government was very different. They talk about secure work, yet the unemployment rate was 5.7%. It's 4.2% today. They talk about wages. Real wages were falling when Labor was last in government. They talk about cost of living. Electricity prices doubled. And they talk about lower taxes, and they took to the Australian people $387 billion of higher taxes. So this Leader of the Opposition, this Labor Party, stands for higher taxes, more spending and a weaker Australian economy.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to his official statement on Saturday. Can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm he has served with the Prime Minister in the Parliament for 15 years, and he has served with the Prime Minister in the Cabinet for 6 years, including as Deputy Prime Minister? When the Deputy Prime Minister says the Prime Minister is, quote, a hypocrite and liar from my observations, and that's over a long period of time, he knows what he's talking about, doesn't he?
The challenge I have is that you can't just quote someone else that's using an unparliamentary term. Now, I'm happy to hear from. To use the term liar is unparliamentary, and there have been many examples where it's been ruled as unparliamentary. The fact that it is used as a quote by anyone, doesn't matter who it is, doesn't negate the fact that it's unparliamentary and it shouldn't be used. I really don't think I need to hear from you. Do you want to reword the question, member for Corio? If you want to be heard on that.
Mr Speaker, just in terms of the precedents,
yeah.
The practice is clear about not being able to evade it by putting someone else's words in your mouth.
Yes.
In terms of the issue with quotations. We are dealing with something new here, where the quote, using the unparliamentary language, is from the very minister we are asking a question from. And of all the precedents, we haven't had that before, and it is reasonable for that to be tested in the House.
I'll happy to hear from the Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, firstly, it's relevant because there was reference to a statement made by the Deputy Prime Minister, so we accept that point. But the assertion that this is somehow requiring a new ruling by you is a nonsense and a concoction by the honourable member opposite. The reality is that the practice is clear in relation to this. It can't be subverted, and I think the ruling is clear, particularly given your words earlier. It doesn't need reinterpretation. It's a cute sort of attempt to work around,
the Leader of the House,
but it's without any
his seat.
substance.
I'm going to rule on the issue. I can't. I'm not aware of a similar instance of this happening before. So, in my view, the precedents are very clear that you can't use a quote to correct an unparliamentary term, and that applies equally in this instance as it does at all times. So, I'm happy to allow the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to reword the question, and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to his official statement on Saturday. Can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm he has served with the Prime Minister in the Parliament for 15 years, and he has served with the Prime Minister in the Cabinet for 6 years, including as Deputy Prime Minister? So when the Deputy Prime Minister made his observations about the Prime Minister, he knew exactly what he was talking about, didn't he?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. I've also worked in the parliament with you for around about the same period of time, so I suppose anything I wish to say about you must
the Deputy Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister,
so,
the Deputy Prime Minister. When you refer to you, you're referring to me as Chair.
The member for Corio. I've been working for the member of Corio for about the same point of time. So using his logic, anything I say about him or anything I say about the member for Grayndler will also stand, because I've been working the whole time with the member for Grayndler. But what I can say, Mr Speaker, is that the only time that I've worked as the Deputy Prime Minister with the member for Cook as the Prime Minister is in this time. I can tell you what is different, because I've never worked with the Prime Minister on defending our nation till we work together now. Something that's so vitally important. And I know those on the Green Labor opposition and the Green Labor opposition do not have a view to the defence of our nation like this Prime Minister has a view to the defence of our nation. I've worked with this Prime Minister as we've built dams. I know that on the Green Labor opposition you have got a great... You can't actually get the Greens across the line for the construction of infrastructure. I've worked with this Prime Minister as we've built the Inland Rail, and that's vitally important. Something the Labor Party and the Greens never did. I've worked with this Prime Minister as we've dealt with one of the greatest pandemics of modern time, and during that period of time, we had one of the greatest successes because we had one of the lowest fatality rates, of anywhere in the globe. Mr Speaker, our working relationship has made sure that we've kept this nation safe, and working with this Prime Minister and the Treasurer We now have unemployment down to 4.2%. We have more Australians employed than I believe any time under the member for Grainlers at any time if he's ever been in Parliament as in Labor government that he's ever had unemployment that low. Mr. Speaker, we've got more Australians in work as I work with this Prime Minister than ever before.
Order, members on my left.
That is a pretty unique relationship, defending our nation, building for our nation, getting Australians into a job, a million more women with work. Mr. Speaker, I am only too happy to tell you of all the things that as I work with this Prime Minister, and I believe that he is quite obviously the better choice at the next election to take Australia into a time where we have so many geopolitical issues that we need a competent hand at the tiller. We need a competent hand to be able to guide this nation through something that will be an incredibly complex time. So, Mr. Speaker, yes, I absolutely stand by this person. This is a great Prime Minister doing a great job.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has expired. The member for Herbert has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister inform the House on the Morrison government's commitment to, and record in, strengthening our national security and keeping Australians safe, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for his question, acknowledging his service to our country in uniform and the way in which he represents veterans in his electorate of Herbert in the greater Townsville community is something that is greatly admired by the local residents in Townsville, Mr. Speaker. Our commitment as a government to keeping our nation safe is demonstrated every day through our commitment to the men and women of the Australian Defence Force and the decisions that we've made to invest in them, in their skills, in providing support to them and to giving them the equipment required to keep our country safe, not just today, Mr. Speaker, but into the future. Now, I've watched, Mr. Speaker, alternative policies. I'm asked about approaches. I've watched the Labor Party over many years, Mr. Speaker, particularly in the run-up to the 2007 election, where with a straight face the Labor Party went to the Australian public and they said that there is no difference between the Labor Party and the coalition when it comes to protecting our borders and in the defence of our nation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've seen this movie before, and so I'm watching this Labor leader out there, Mr. Speaker, trotting out exactly the same lines as Kevin Rudd did in 2007, remembering, of course, that this Leader of the Opposition was trained by Kevin Rudd. He was the Deputy Prime Minister of Kevin Rudd, right? So Labor was out there before 2007 saying they'd support the Defence Force. They're out there in 2022 saying they'd support the Defence Force in exactly the same way as the Liberal Party did if they were to win the next election. I'll tell you what happened, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell you what happened when Labor was in government and this man was the Deputy Prime Minister. They cut defence spending. They took money away, Mr. Speaker, from those men and women who wear the uniform of this country. They took money out of investing in every program across defence, across ASIO, across the Federal Police, across the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, Mr. Speaker, and our country was less safe because of this man, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? There was no lesson that's been learned. No lesson that's been learned at all, because he is repeating exactly the same mistake now. So if you're worried about where China is and you're worried about where Russia is, if you're worried about the Ukraine, if you are worried about the geopolitical circumstances, Mr. Speaker, in this world, if you're worried about the uncertainty in the Indo-Pacific, you wouldn't vote for Labor at the next election,
Leader
Mr.
of the House
Speaker.
will resume his seat. The Leader of the House has completed his answer. The member for Eden Monaro has the call.
Across my electorate, Gladys Berejiklian said she could not trust the Prime Minister, telling a Liberal Cabinet Minister the Prime Minister is, and I quote, more concerned with politics than people, and I quote, "Lives are at stake and he's just obsessed with petty political point scoring." Why was the Prime Minister obsessed with political point scoring during the bushfires, and why didn't he just do his job?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, I mean, it's clear that that is not a statement that has been made by the former Premier of New South Wales, and I think that's confirmation in relation to that, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the House will just stop for a moment. I can't hear. The member for Kingsford Smith should be in Beijing skating at the moment because he's on very thin ice. I'll get the Leader of the House to start again, please.
We would be happy to approve the visa, Mr Speaker, for him to go.
Members on my right
Yes.
will equally.
Mr.
Members
Speaker,
on my right will equally be quiet.
Mr Speaker, referring to an unsubstantiated media gossip speculation piece is completely out of order, Mr Speaker. This is not a statement made by the former Premier of New South Wales. It is speculation, media speculation, about a tweet that may have been sent to somebody who turns out not to have been a federal cabinet. You know, I mean, the story goes on, Mr Speaker. I don't know, but this is not a document that can be referred to, or a statement that can be referred to, and it's certainly not within the Prime Minister's responsibility to respond to gossip, and it should be ruled out of order on that basis.
I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. There's nothing unparliamentary in the quotation that's been provided. The question goes directly to the Prime Minister's responsibilities and the way he does those. What the Leader of the House is asking is for you to start to become the arbiter on the veracity of any quotation that is brought forward in this parliament. And if that starts to become the role of the Speaker, I think it puts you in an impossible position and would be a real change for the way that this House operates.
Yeah. Order. 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 As I indicated just yesterday, I cannot be an arbiter of fact as to whether something is true or not true, or right or wrong. The question, from what I heard, which was not complete, from what I heard was in order, and I'll give the call to the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, as the former Premier said herself in her own statement, she did not confirm any such statement at all, Mr Speaker. She did not. And her own direct contact with me on this matter, Mr Speaker, she has said likewise. So, Mr Speaker, this is what we've become used to from the opposition in putting these matters forward. It's not about policy, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition wants to have a character context with me, Mr Speaker. Bring it on.
The Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister. The member for
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member for Moncrief has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's strong border management has helped keep Australians safe and now enabled the opening of our international border for tourists? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. The Deputy Prime Minister. The Deputy Prime Minister is warned. The Deputy Prime Minister is warned. The member for Gellibrand will leave under 94A. The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. Clearly, the reopening of our international borders to fully vaccinated travellers in less than 2 weeks now has been very well received on the Gold Coast and the members' electorate of Moncrieff. The Gold Coast, of course, is a city that relies on tourism, but there are many destinations right across Australia that are also pretty excited about the fact that our international borders will be reopening in less than 2 weeks. Now, Mr Speaker, our very swift and decisive action to close the borders at the beginning of the pandemic clearly meant that many lives were saved. It was a very essential action to make sure that we were making sure that our communities were going to be very safe throughout the pandemic. But we were always aware that we would need to reopen those borders as soon as we possibly could. Now, we've faced a very rapidly evolving situation here. We've dealt with a whole range of challenges over the last 2 years, and I mean we very broadly, and I speak not only of the government but also the people of Australia. Because of the actions that have been taken, we are now in a very, very strong position to be able to fully open our borders to fully vaccinated travellers, and we are doing that from February the 21st. And that has all been possible because we, as a government, have taken the very difficult decisions that we needed to take. And the coalition government will always take the difficult decisions in protecting our borders because we know how important that is. And that's whether it's biosecurity control, whether it's record drug seizures, whether it's making our ports and our airports more secure, whether it's stopping criminals and pedophiles by cancelling their visas, or importantly, whether it's stopping the boats and cutting off the people smuggling trade. That is part of the coalition's DNA. Now, I have been asked about alternate approaches, and we've seen the outcome of an alternate policy, and that is more than 50,000 illegal arrivals on more than 800 boats, where tragically, more than 1,200 people lost their lives at sea. Now, that was the reality, and we know that Labor always likes to have an each-way bet. They'll say before an election that they're going to be strong on borders, but we know they've proved that that is actually not the reality. Now, Mr Speaker, I can't bring myself to even contemplate what the border policy would be of a Labor-Greens government. Now, the opposition leader has previously said that he could not turn back the boats. And we know that the member for Melbourne doesn't like the idea of borders at all. So imagine what the policy would be like if ever there was a Labor-Greens government here. What a power-sharing arrangement that would be. The people smugglers would be jumping for joy.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Before members depart the chamber, there isn't a matter that needs to be dealt with. I have to report that the order of the day relating to the address of congratulation moved by the Prime Minister in connection with the Platinum Jubilee of Her Majesty the Queen has been debated in the Federation Chamber and is returned to the House. I present a certified copy of the motion. I understand it is the wish of the House to consider the matter immediately. The question is that the motion moved by the Honourable the Prime Minister be agreed to. To signify their support for the address, I invite honourable members to rise in their place. I thank the House. The Leader of the House with papers.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
Those members leaving the House will do so quickly and quietly, please.